I will say at the beginning there are two schools of thought. Some say that Sufism is the esoteric branch of Islam. And in fact, the first transmission of Sufism was between the Prophet Muhammad and Abu Baka in the cave. It was this secret, silent transmission from heart to heart that took place in the cave. That is that thread of Sufism that begins there. And then there is another school that says Sufism, long before it was called Sufism, is the ancient, ancient mystery of love. It was always present back to the very beginning, before the beginning. In the first breath of human consciousness, there was the breath of God. In the first spark of human consciousness, there was this deep understanding of love, of mystical love. And that it was always there, woven throughout humanity, through the history of humanity. But through the teachings of Islam, it, in a way, fermented. It became alive in a particular way that we now call Sufism. It is, of course, an inner kernel of truth. It is not about outer form. It always goes back to the truth. Now, some of the early Sufis, they were not, they didn't belong to any Sufi order. It was before Sufi orders. There were just these mystics. And at the beginning, they were very, very ascetic. Most of them were very, very ascetic. For example, there was the 8th century Sufi teacher, Hassan of Basra, who really aspired just to eat as little as possible and sleep as little as possible. And he was the teacher of a Sufi many of you know called Rabia, who was the first woman Sufi saint, who also lived in the 8th century. And she was both a tremendous ascetic. She was sold into slavery when she was young, and as a slave, she did all her household duties during the day and then prayed all night. And it was only when one night, when her master was wandering in the house and he heard her praying, that he discovered the depth of her devotion and set her free. And so she lived an incredibly austere life, but was also one of the first people in the tradition of Sufism to talk about divine love, that there is this love affair between the human being and God. So she was both austere, but also there was this thread of love. And then there was a 9th century Sufi master called Dhul Nun. Remember, this was before there were Sufi orders. There were just these saints, these luminaries, like little bits of divine light that came to earth, that lived that light. Dhul Nun was the Egyptian. He lived in Egypt. He was supposed to be a magician. And he was the first Sufi to develop what we call Fanaa and Baka. And Fanaa is a process of annihilation, of getting rid of the ego. So it began to be developed back then in the 9th century. These stages of Fanaa that lead to Baka. And Baka is a state of abiding with God or abiding in God. It is a state of complete fulfillment. You're just with God. There is no journey anymore. You are just in God in the state. Fanaa is all of the struggle, all of the difficulties, all of the trials, all the tribulations. As you are torn away from your identity of yourself, of who you think you are. And then you discover something else. There is this presence in your heart. There is this sweetness in your heart, and it gets deeper and deeper. And you begin to live in that. And then your whole spiritual practice, your whole relationship to God changes. You don't look for God anymore. He is with you. And you go deeper and deeper into this state of being in God, of being with God. But Dhul Nun was one of the first Sufis to talk about that. But at the same time, he practiced self-mortification, but he knew the supremacy of love. He was also a lover. So always remember, they may talk about austerities, there may be practices to help you to get rid of the ego, of the little self, of what the Sufis call the nafs, the lower self. But he wanted to have, there is a legend that when he died, there was seen written in green on his brow, "This is the friend of God. He died in the love of God. This is the slain of God by the sword of God." He is a friend of God. He died in the love of God. It is about love. You know, those of you who have ever really been in love in a human experience know that it is not easy. You give yourself in ways you never thought to give yourself. You become vulnerable in ways you never thought you would become vulnerable. And that is like, the Sufis say, that is like playing with dolls compared to the real love affair. The love affair that takes place within your own heart, this passion with God. And that's what Sufis have written about mainly. Yes, there are techniques for deepening this love, for living this love, but these are the tears they have cried. This is the ecstasy they have experienced. This friend of God died in the love of God. So, although the early Sufi saints regarded renunciation of everything other than God as the most important quality of the wayfarer, it was become more and more stressed that the love for God is primary. And there is this beautiful saying by a great, great Sufi saint, Bayezid Bastami, in the 9th century. He was one of those incredibly intoxicated mystics who will go into a state of trance, a state of intoxication. And he said these things like, "Under this cloak there is only God," because he was so much merged, so much immersed in God. There was just God. There was just that presence that, there is only God, but to live it in full consciousness, that is something else. Maybe I should just stress that. There is only God. There can never be anything other than God. Otherwise, there would be two. There would be God and not God. There would be two. And God is one. Everything is God. Everything here is God. You are God. The carpet is God. The air is God. There is nothing other than God. And it's easy to say those words, but to live it in full consciousness, to be in that state where there is only God, that is the full consciousness of divine union. But he said that what really matters is not even our love for God, but God's love for us. Remember I talked about the two C's. And the one human C is our longing for God. But the divine C is his love for us. And that is something that is covered over so much. I don't know why. I don't know why it's something that you have to fight for, that you have to cry for, that you have to spill blood for. Because it is, in a way, the most primary thing is not your longing for God, but God's longing for you, God's love for you. That is, in a way, the stamp of existence. Everything is created out of love. Everything is an outpouring of love. If you knew how much love flows into creation every moment, you wouldn't even bother to look for love. You would just be there and, open your mouth wide and drink it down. Everything is made of love. Every moment, everything is remade with love again and again and again. But it took Bayezid Bastami a long time to realize this. At the beginning, I was mistaken in 4 respects. I concerned myself to remember God, to know him, to love him, and to seek him. When I had come to the end, I saw that he had remembered me before I remembered him, that his knowledge of me had preceded my knowledge of him, that his love towards me had existed before my love to him, and he had sought me before I sought him. So that is the divine ocean, which is God's mystery, that we are at this place where God's mystery is experienced, and we can be that place consciously where his mystery is experienced. Everything is that place where his mystery is experienced unconsciously, unknowing. Everything is that moment of divine revelation, but we can be that place where it is conscious, where we know it, where we come alive through his love. And also, Bayezid realized that rather than renunciation of the outer world, as in the early, very, very austere mystics, it is the renunciation of the nafs, of the ego, of our lower self that matters. God spoke to him, "What dost thou desire?" And Bayezid replied, "I desire thee." And God said, "Until there remains even one particle of Bayezidness in thee, that desire cannot be fulfilled." So out of these early mystics there came this great understanding. There is this divine love, there is this outpouring of divine love, but then there is what we call the ego that veils us from it, that gets in the way. And that rather than trying to renounce the outer world, outer poverty, what matters is what the Sufis call the poverty of the heart, this stepping aside from oneself, this Fanaa, this annihilation of the ego, of what you think you are. And that is if there is any work on the path. And it's difficult because a love affair is not really about work. But there is an effort, yes. And the effort is to allow yourself to be stripped bare, to be taken back to the essence, to have all of those images of yourself, of what you think you are, fall away. This is Fanaa. And Sufis have written a lot about this, and there are techniques to help you to let that happen, to allow yourself to be stripped bare. So there is no I anymore that gets in the way. This I who you think you are. There is a science, if you like, of losing yourself. And Sufism has, for over 1,000 years, developed that science as your contribution. Yes, you have to learn how to live this love affair, but you also have to learn how to let go of yourself. How to become nothing, how to become zero, how to go through this process of Fanaa. And that is the part of the science of Sufism, why they attach so much importance to psychology from very, very early on. How can you lose yourself? How can you let yourself go? How can you learn to be lost in love? Now, Bayezid was completely intoxicated with God, and maybe I should say that in Sufism there are two paths. There is the path of intoxication and the path of sobriety. Because there are ways to get completely drunk with love of God. Completely. You are completely drunk. You are intoxicated. You forget yourself. You don't know who you are. You don't know where you are. You are just completely in love. It is, I guess most of us have been drunk on what they call alcohol at some point in our lives. But this is a heightened form of drunkenness. It is divine intoxication. You are just lost in the presence of God. You don't know who you are, you don't know where you are, you don't know what day of the week it is. It doesn't matter. Mostly at the beginning you can only bear it for a few minutes because it is so potent. It is like I always say, it is like 100 proof alcohol. it does strange things to your mind. You actually have to train the mind to bear intoxication. Now there is one path of Sufism that says you just get more and more intoxicated. You lose yourself more and more in that drunken state of being with God. You wander. You don't care if you don't have a home, if you don't have any clothes, if you don't have any possessions. It doesn't matter. Who cares about things like that when you are lost in God? And then there is the other path, which is called sobriety, that says that's all very well, but you have to be able to come back, to put your feet on the ground, to get up in the morning, to take the kids to school, to go to the office. That actually one should be able to bear those deep states while living an ordinary outer life. And I should just mention that one of the great proponents of this was the 9th century Sufi master Junaid in Baghdad. It's just worth remembering that it was over 1,000 years ago that there was this extraordinary flowering of Sufism in the Middle East. That Baghdad was a spiritual center of the world. This was before Genghis Khan's armies destroyed Baghdad in the 13th century. And it was these incredible Sufi masters were all there in Baghdad. And there was this deep understanding of how to live divine love, of this science of love, which is also a science of the human being, of the real human being. There was this incredible understanding of the depths of a human being and how to live in those depths and how both to be intoxicated and also to have your feet on the ground. And then in the midst of that, there was this great mystic Al-Hallaj, who actually Junaid criticized. He even threw him out of his meditation group for being too ecstatic, because Al-Hallaj said what had never been said before in public. I am he whom I love, and he whom I love is me. This great secret of Sufism, that we are one with God, that we are God, we are one. There is never two, there never was two, there never was me and God. An illusion. This was the great secret of Sufism, which is why Sufis are called the people of the secret. Al-Hallaj, this mystic, lived it and spoke about it in the marketplace. Al-Hallaj, I am the truth, which is always known by the mystic, that we are one with God. Unio mystica, that state which every mystical path takes you to realize that you are one with God. This moment in your consciousness when the whole consciousness of yourself breaks apart to reveal what is in the core of everything and what is in the core of your own consciousness, that you are one with God. Doesn't matter what path you follow, they all take you to that place of divine oneness, that seed from which everything grew. That is why even in our human experiences, we long for that oneness. We try to meet somebody whom we can merge with, whom we can become lost in. In physical sexuality, there is this experience for a moment of meeting and merging and this ecstasy of oneness that lasts just a few seconds. But for the mystic, of course, it becomes a conscious state. But that has always been the secret until that time in Baghdad when this crazy mystic Al-Hallaj stood in the marketplace. And of course, he was crucified for it. He spent 11 years in prison, and then he was crucified. And he has afterwards been known as the martyr of lovers. He is, in a way, for the Sufi, the one who made this secret of divine love public. Before, you could never talk in public like this about that mystical secret. It was heresy. God is God, human beings are separate, they are other. And Sufism held for those early centuries as a secret, only sharing it with initiates in closed rooms. Junaid, one of the greatest Sufis of all time, only ever had 20 disciples at a time because he would not share it in public. He said, this is too esoteric, this is too secret, ever to be spoken about except in the closed circle of initiates. And suddenly it was broken open by Al-Hallaj, who was prepared to give his blood for it, who was prepared to be killed in public for it, to suffer this horrible experience. There's actually a very moving story about on his way to the crucifixion, to his crucifixion, he was being taken through the streets. And he was a very deep, obviously mystic. He'd spent 11 years in jail. And he was in a very, very deep state. And there is a deep mystical state that you can go into where the physical world doesn't touch you anymore. And people were throwing stones at him as he was going by, and nothing hurt him because he was in communion with God, completely lost to this world. And he had a dear friend who was called Shibli. Shibli was also a great Sufi master. And Shibli was on the balcony looking at Al-Hallaj going by. And while everybody else threw stones at him, Shibli threw a rose. And when the rose touched Al-Hallaj's skin, Al-Hallaj looked up and saw Shibli looking down at him. And he said, "Why did you do that?" "Because you threw it with love, and it touched me with love. It brought me back to this world. And now I have to suffer everything in full consciousness." So that was a moment in which this mystical secret of love broke out of this closed space. And, it was centuries later that Rumi said one should go gladly to the gallows like Al-Hallaj. One should live the mystery of dying through love like Al-Hallaj. But underneath it, there is this oneness that belongs to love. And I told you, this is the place where the two seas meet. This is the place of Kidr. This is the place where the dead fish becomes alive. This is Sufism. And in that place where the two seas meet, there is only oneness. There is nothing other than oneness. There never can be anything other than oneness. There is the divine world and there is the human world, and there is this place within the heart where it comes together, where everything is one, it always was one, and it always will be one, except there is no time there. There is only the moment. And that is really what it means to be a Sufi, is to live that mystery of divine oneness. I am he whom I love, and he whom I love is I. If thou seest me, thou seest him. And if thou seest him, thou seest us both. Of course, there have been many, many other great saints that have followed, that have lived that calling to love, that stamp of love that we now call Sufism. And slowly, these great luminaries developed groups around them, and these groups became Sufi orders, and now we have all these different Sufi orders. For example, the Sufi order that formed around Rumi, the Mevlevi, and the practices that are taught in the different ways to live that love, to walk this path we call Sufism, which is not really a path, it is a way to be with God. It is a way to love God and to be loved by God. But I think, here, whatever it is, over 1,000 years later, it is helpful to remember how it began. There was no organization. There never is a hierarchy. There were just these people who were called to love God and who lived their loving for God. Some spoke about it. Rabia just wrote a few poems. And Rumi wrote hundreds of poems. But they were just people who lived their loving for God, who uncovered the secret of what it really means to be a human being. And that is the heritage we have been given. And sometimes it's important to go back. We are so easily caught up in all of the forms, all of the elaborations of it all. And it is like if you live your own calling, there is this cry in the heart. That is all. Sufism was at first heartache. It is your heartache. It is your desire to know the secret of what it means to be a human being, which is we are one with God. It was always like that. And that is this history of Sufism. That is this stamp. That is this gift to humanity of those who lived and died, their longing for God, their truth.